Okay, go live. Okay, I think seems like yes, we are live. Can someone can just quickly confirm that they can hear me fine via comments? Just waiting for a few people to respond. Vishesh, you can hear me fine, right? Oh yeah.
Yes,
Can
yes,
you
I
hear me
can.
fine? I think it's Gaurav. Gaurav, can you hear me fine? Just waiting for a few people to respond. I had an internet issue, man, so I was just running around the last 5 minutes. Oh yes, okay. The multiple people have responded that they can hear me. Great. I think we can start the session. Hi everyone. Hope everyone's staying safe, staying at home. This is the second episode of our MBA application journey series, where we have conversations with MBA candidates from top business schools and learn about their application journeys. I'm Ayush Gandhi. I'm a second year MBA candidate at Columbia Business School. Sorry, I'm a first year MBA candidate at Columbia Business School. Vishesh is a second year candidate. So before I introduce the guest and start the session, just some general admin rules. I already have questions for our speaker, which is Vishesh, and I expect to cover them in about 30 minutes or so. And I would then open it up for questions from your end. Just a small request: try to be as specific as you can with your question. I think it'll be really useful for us to navigate the conversation. Um, so without further ado, today's speaker is another one of my very good friends, an ex-colleague from FSG. Vishesh Parnerkar is a second-year MBA candidate at Booth School of Business. He also received an admit from Yale, but decided to go to Booth. Vishesh did his undergrad from IIT Bombay, and before Booth, he was working as a management consultant with PwC for a bit, and then with FSG, which is where I was colleagues with him. So welcome, Vishesh.
Thank you very much.
And I think I would love to start it off by just understanding how did you decide to do an MBA in the first place? I mean, given like a pretty stellar career that you were having both at PwC and then at FSG, like what was your primary motivation to go for an MBA?
Uh, Good question. I think a couple of things. First and foremost was um, a feeling in my career that things had kind of stagnated, and there was plenty of growth opportunities available, but there would be more growth opportunities available if I had done an MBA. So I think that was one feeling, I think, which was further substantiated by the fact that plenty of my friends and colleagues who were, let's say, 4 or 5 years down the line in their career path had done an MBA, and I could see the difference that it made in their careers. So these two things combined kind of made me think that, you know what, I should maybe try to transition in some sense through an MBA. I think the third thing, which kind of almost, let's say, made me kind of register on all the business school application platforms was the fact that I thought the MBA experience in the US is very, very different from the kind of MBA experience you have provided in India. The diversity of class, the quality of professors, the quality of teaching, and just the overall experience I thought was just would be an amazing for me to have at this career juncture. So I think all these three reasons combined just forced me to do an MBA.
Sure, amazing. And I think just a follow up to that, like one of the big concerns that applicants typically have when they're applying for business schools in the US is the big financial burden that they'll have. So, would
Right.
just love to understand, like, how did you factor that aspect while making the decision?
Right. I think good question. I think it's yes, it is big. It's not a cheap MBA. Everyone knows that. You know that as
Mhm.
well. I you can think about it a couple of ways, right? One, it's an investment into your future career. Um, And if you think about an investment, which is a long-term investment, and you see if you're expecting to see the payoffs not 2 years down the line, not 3 years down the line, but 5 or 10 years down the line, then in my head it kind of makes sense. Obviously, everyone has a different risk tolerance. Everyone has different priorities in life, and they should decide for themselves. I can just talk about my story. I don't have any sort of personal commitments right now, which I want, which will lead me, let's say, to go back to India. So I can decide to choose to stay in the US if I want to, which will again help me pay off my loan. A lot of people have commitments back in India, which raises the question: if you're earning in Indian rupees, then how do you pay back a dollar loan? Um, so I would say those commitments, those concerns are very valid, and I think everyone should think about the kind of priorities they have in their life, the amount of flexibility they have in their life in terms of where they're going to live, um, and decide accordingly as to how they want, do they want to take the investment risk or not. For me, it was a risky proposition, obviously taking out a big loan. But I thought I would stay in the US for a few years. If the US visa did not work out, I'd probably um, work in, let's say, another, a big currency country like either Dubai or Canada or like Singapore, which will again allow me to pay back the loan. And I didn't have any sort of commitments, attached to me, like any sort of, let's say, I don't have a partner right now. Not like I'm not looking to get married anytime soon, things like that. So if those things are also bothering you, I think they add to the complication. But for me, did not. That was not the case. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. Absolutely. Uh, Great. And I think just jumping on to the next question, I know you had a stellar GMAT score of 760. So keeping that aside, like how did you go about identifying which business schools do you want to apply to? Like, did you like make that decision by attending events? Like, did you speak to current year students? And would love to understand that a little bit.
Um, Yes, I think the first thing that kind of made me choose schools was like the kind of schools my seniors had gone to. So I'd known, let's say, plenty of seniors who I knew personally, and like friends of seniors who had some acquaintance with from IIT Bombay who had gone to different business schools across the US. And that kind of helped me inform the perception of business schools, because I knew some people went to like HBS, some people went to Booth, some people went to Kellogg. So in my head, these kind of became the safe schools. In some sense, they were like, okay, people from my undergrad are going to these schools. And I knew that these seniors, I looked up to them and I trusted their decisions. And if they made the decision to go to these schools, I thought these schools were good. So that was like the first kind of filter. The second filter was obviously in terms of some like kind of brand they have, and the kind of education they offer, which came a lot, which was informed by essentially going to their websites, reading about them, um, also attending the sessions they were organizing in India, the outreach sessions, meeting the admissions people and things like that, and just getting a sense of what they're all about. Um, yes, I think primarily these two. And I think when I kind of was close to applying, then I used to talk to the people who were actually studying in the school or had just graduated, to get a sense of what the school was like right now, and real things like, what kind of courses do they offer, what kind of clubs do they have, what kind of recruiting opportunities does the school offer, what kind of location the school is in, how does that make a difference in the experience and things like
Okay, great. And I think just coming to the big question that we have here, which is like the elephant in the room, like how did you decide between Yale and Booth? Like both really top schools, and I know Yale aligns a little bit with your past experience in the social impact space because Yale is really known for that. So like, was it a tough decision, and how did you sort of decide between the two?
it was definitely not a very easy decision, because again, like, to throw a bit of color into this, I was waitlisted at Booth, and I got an admit from Yale. So I was like, and I loved Yale as a school because I'd spoken to a lot of students who went to Yale. I knew a few of my undergrad friends who actually went to Yale as well. And I was pretty much like prepared to pack my bags and leave for Yale, leave for New Haven. Um, Fortunately, at that time, and Booth was obviously one of the schools I also wanted to go to. And fortunately, I had I had an offer from Booth as well, and the wait list converted. So I was in a good position where I had to decide between Yale and Booth. I thought about it in a couple of ways. I think the easiest way that came to my mind was in just in terms of like overall brand, in terms of business school. Um, and talking to a few people who I knew had gone to the US for business school, they told me that Yale, being a great school, being a great experience, still in like Booth has a much better brand uh, in terms of just business school presence in the US. I think that one thing that really kind of made me take that decision. Apart from that, I had heard a lot about Chicago. I think that also made my decision a little easier. Chicago was a great city to be in. I knew all of the business school students lived in one building in downtown Chicago. They all went out together, had a good time. So I thought just like those factors of being in the city of Chicago as opposed to New Haven, which is more of a university town, going to Booth, which has in some sense a much bigger brand presence in the US as compared to Yale, just made me kind of lean towards Booth.
Sure, amazing. And I think the next question is something that I personally struggled with a lot, and I do remember like having conversations about with you about that also, was regarding the whole MBA consultant piece and whether you should hire one or not. And again, it's a significant investment. So, and I know you did hire a
Yeah.
consultant, so would just love to understand a little bit about like how you sort of made that decision and how was your experience overall, like what value did a consultant add to your application journey?
Right, right. Um, yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice which people look for, and I know you look for it, and I know a lot of other of my close friends also look for it. So this is my story, right? Like I was thinking of applying to business schools. I was fairly sure about whatever the 5, 10 business schools I wanted to get into. But I come from a family where they have never gone to the US for education. Um, and they have very limited experience in terms of how to apply to these schools. Many of my friends as well, they wanted to go, they were in the process, but again, they did not come with a wealth of experience as to how to apply. So I thought one of the first things I would ideally do is tap into a resource which would help me inform my decisions. Otherwise, I would just be on my own, and I don't know if I'll be good or not. Um, and I knew a close friend of mine who had just entered a business school in the US, and he had sought help from an MBA consulting organization, and essentially he described his experience to be very good. So, and he named a couple of firms which he had in mind, which he had kind of searched while going through his own MBA application process. So I kind of took that list, started calling up people, started having beginning conversations, preliminary conversations with them, and I finally settled on the firm which my friend had chosen because I mean obviously his reference meant a lot, but also the conversation which I had with the people made me think that okay, these people knew what they were talking about, and the other thing was these people would take care of me. I think there was a certain level of support which I needed, which translated in the phone call I had with them. So I think just the fact that I needed a resource in which I could tap into, made me think that I should go for MBA consulting firm, and I specifically went with one of them because of the reference provided with my friend. The other question a lot of people have in their mind is should they go with like an international MBA consulting firm? The ones, and I know there are plenty of names out there.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously, I don't doubt the quality they offer. They're obviously a bit expensive, pegged to dollar rates. So I think, from my perspective, I didn't have the financial resources to kind of justify an international consulting firm, or rather, I would say the incremental benefit from an international consulting firm wouldn't justify that dollar rate. I know friends of mine have taken those international consulting firms and come to the US, and are doing their MBA degrees here. So obviously, there's not a wrong decision you can make. I think you just need to make sure what your constraints are, what you're looking for, and decide accordingly.
Sure. And okay, that makes sense. And just I think just a follow up to that, like how was your experience overall with the MBA consultant? Like, was it as you had expected, or like did you face certain roadblocks with them?
It was, I would say, I would probably put it as mixed. So there were several pros to the experience, and there were several things that helped me from the MBA consulting firm. But there are also things which I was, I don't know, implicitly expecting them to do, which they did not. Um, so I think let me start with the pros, right? Like I think the one thing they really bring in is just experience of like how do business schools behave, how do they read the application, what are the how should you write the essay, right? What's the framing? What are the kind of words do you use? Um, how do you lay out a story and things like that? You know, like basic fundamentals of a business school application, which by the way a lot of people in India might already know because they might have applied to US for undergrad and things like that. So me not going to US for undergrad makes that difference, right? I didn't know any of that. Yeah, so just the basics of applying to business school, I think they kind of help you with. The second thing I think they really help you with is just kind of understanding different schools philosophy. And obviously anyone can go to their website and read that, but I think because of the fact that they've coached many students enter those business schools, I think they give you like a first hand perspective on what's needed to enter, let's say, MIT versus, let's say, UC Berkeley Haas.
Mhm.
Um, I think, and I think the third thing also, which is I think very important, is I think they spend time with you in the sense of understanding your story and how do you translate the story onto the essay, onto the paper, and help you with like tactical things like recommendations. Who do you get recommendations from? What should be the language there and things like that. So I think these three things are very important and kind of really helped me ground myself and gave me some sense of this is what's needed in an MBA application. This is what's a good MBA application. In terms of what I thought was not enough was just I think I remember doing like let's say a couple of schools with my MBA consulting firm, and then when we moved on to the next round of applications, I remember it was very the advice was very incremental. The MBA application firm essentially said, you know what, just like modify this essay, place the first paragraph at the end, and start with the second paragraph, and that's it. And I
Yeah.
thought, I think that's like, that's a valid way of doing it. But I thought that was like too much of a shortcut, and it would be fine if I said that, but I was surprised they said it. So just
Right.
that just kind of bothered me. Like if the MBA application firm, like if the consulting firm is kind of advising me that, then where are they coming from? Like, are they just looking to like quickly, submit a few apps and just see like, let's hope one of them works out. So that kind of discouraged me. The other thing was also like initially the consulting firm spent a lot of time with me, but later on they did not. Like later on was very like high level touch points of half an hour, ask questions and we'll answer, things like that. Which again, I was expecting them to be a little more proactive about it, but at the end, the owners came entirely on me. Um, so I think maybe these things, maybe I should have expected. Maybe I was wrong in kind of expecting this kind of active involvement from their side. But just these things kind of made me think, what, maybe I can add more value as well. And like I can think that you can place the first paragraph at the end, start with the second paragraph, and things like that. And I was expecting more value there. So mixed experience. In all, I'll crystallize in a couple of sentences. Like, and this is the advice I think I gave you and a couple of friends. I think you can think of hiring consulting firms because obviously they have a wealth of knowledge, but you can think of hiring them as a pilot study, right? Like hire them for one school or two schools and see the kind of experience you're getting from them. Learn from their experience. Like they'll teach you plenty of things. So you might not need them for the third school. You might not need them for the fourth school because you've already learned everything that is there to learn. And everything else is
Sure.
just on your experience and how you write the essay and how you write the app.
Sure. Very rightly said. Just jumping on to the next question, and I think a lot of people struggle with this. I know I struggled with this. Is how do you really craft your story for the short term and the long term goals. And there are people like who've not necessarily thought about this in great depth, but when they start applying, it suddenly hits them that, oh, like what should I put in this essay? So how did you think about that?
Um, yeah, I think that's another very valid concern on how to craft your short-term and long-term goals. I'll start with a couple of things. One is like a lot of people come to business school, come to their MBAs, Booth, Columbia, all these business schools with their short-term, long-term goals in their application. Um, and they don't follow through. I'll be honest, right? They don't follow through. And you could
I'm
question like,
following
are
it.
they? Well, I mean, I think you're in the minority. Uh, anyway, so they don't follow through, and the question, a lot of people might say, you know what, like, just can I then just write anything, right? Um, the other thing is do the admissions people when they're reading the application know that whatever 80% or 70% of the people are actually not following through their goals. And I've talked to admission folks and they know it. They know that people write something on the application, and life evolves, life changes, plans change, people change, priorities change. From just keeping those things in background, I think you should think about crafting your short-term, long-term goals, something that's logical, right? Something that's defensible, something that makes sense given your past background, given your ambitions, given your priorities, right? Obviously, I'm not saying that you should be conservative. I mean, you can be very ambitious in terms of your goals. Your goals could be like starting a $1 billion startup, which is perfectly valid. But I mean, just like any other goal in life, you need to back up that goal with some sort of credentials, right? You can't be working in supply chain for 5 years and say that, oh, I want to start like a social networking startup, something like that. There has to be some sort of connection, which would make sense not only to you but also to an outside observer. So in terms of that, like short-term goals, again, like coming down tactically, short-term goals typically mean something. What are you going to do post MBA? And long-term goals are something more of like 5 to 10 years long-term goals. Now, in terms of MBA applications, reading your applications, obviously they're focusing initially on the short-term goal because they want to see, okay, what does this person want to do after they graduate, after they leave Booth or Columbia. And there, I think you should be very specific and be very realistic, right? And obviously, everyone knows goals change. Um, Mine changed. I know a lot of people, other people's goals changed. So just put up something that you think you want to pursue at this point in time. Something that kind of aligns with your story. Something that, if read on an application, makes the person believe that this goal is real. Um, that's the short term goal. The long term goal is more ambitious, right? They want to see, okay, what are your goals in life? Like, what do you want to achieve? Where are you going with this? And that's much more nebulous, right? Like, there's no, I mean, you can write pretty much anything as a your long term goal and be able to defend it. And the question is, what can you defend in an interview, right? And believe it or not, if it's indefensible, it really comes across in an interview. You can really see people say something and not mean it. And when that happens, business schools hate that, right? They don't like when people say something and you're saying something for the sake of saying it. Think about what your short-term and long-term goals could be. Make sure they're ambitious, obviously, because I know all people who apply to MBA business schools are ambitious by default. Be obviously realistic, and see something that's in line with your experience and defensible. Yeah, I don't want to go on and on. So does that make sense? Like I'll just wait for you to respond.
It does, absolutely. And I think there are different ways to look at it. Like the way I went about in my applications was sort of an inverted structure where I start with what my long term goal is, like literally what my ambition in life is. And then what do I need to do just before that, which can help me accomplish that long term goal? So that's the short term goal.
Right.
And then what do I need to do to accomplish the short-term goal, which is the MBA? So I mean, like, they're just like, I don't think there's like
Yeah.
a right or a wrong answer here, but like they're just like different ways you look at it. But I think a couple of things that you mentioned, which I think are very important, is how it all connects. Like you said, right? I mean, if you're let's say like someone working in IT, and then you say that after an MBA you want to switch to pharma, and you absolutely have no undergrad or work experience in the pharma sector, it'll be really hard for you to justify that move. So I think it can be anything as long as it seems realistic and it actually connects with your story. So I think very rightly pointed out. And with that, just jumping on to the next question, which is again a very interesting one, is out of the different sort of leadership examples that you're contemplating between, like in your work life and like your undergrad years, how did you sort of decide like which are the one or two that you really want to talk about in your essays?
Uh, so a lot of leadership stories that can come across in an application. People think of personal stories. People think of professional stories. My process, and I think that could be a process for anyone, would be just to make a long list of all the stories you have in your mind. Try to flesh them out a bit. Try to think about, how did this start? What happened in between? What are the turning points in the story? What was your thinking? What was your frame of mind, and things like that. And essentially show it to people, right? Like show it to people. And if you're thinking of working with a consulting firm, a consulting firm will definitely should do this with you if they're not doing it already. They will also ask you to flesh out those stories, and they'll probably do some sort of discussion with you on those stories and see what of those stories could possibly, achieve two things. One is tell the admissions committee who you really are, make do a really good job of that, and B, also make you come across as someone who can possibly fit into the MBA class of that school. So as long as you can achieve those two things with the stories, I think you're good to go. I think again, like people are a little shy of sharing stories, and which is completely understandable. But I think you should feel comfortable sharing these stories with your, let's say, close friends or close colleagues, and get their feedback. I was very surprised by the amount of feedback and the honest feedback I got from my close friends and honest colleagues. And I that and they actually went out of the way to kind of help me craft that story, and help me shape that story. Um, so yeah, that's how I thought about it. Most of my, I would say almost 100% of my leadership stories, quote unquote, came from work. So essentially, specific parts of projects I was involved in. I was in social impact consulting, as you very well know. So there were projects where there were issues, there were problems, and how did I overcome them? There were projects where I was leading a certain module. So what were the objectives there, and how did I achieve those? So those were roughly the leadership stories. And in short, the lesson here is to iterate, write down something, get feedback, iterate, write down something, get feedback.
Sure, absolutely. That sounds great. Just moving on to the next bit, which is the recommendation piece. And I know, like, I think one of the common questions that we get here is, you know, and I know, like, you face this dilemma as well, is like you work very closely with your managers and your immediate supervisors, but there are also these senior people in the organization, like the managing directors, with whom you haven't really worked very closely with, but again, they carry a certain title which can carry a lot of weight in the recommendation process. So how did you sort of navigate through that dilemma, and like how did you just overall choose between identifying your recommenders?
Yeah, I think another point where a lot of people say different things sometimes, and it's difficult to kind of agree on one thing. Um, I was, and I'd applied on a couple of rounds, so I'll tell you like how did my thought process kind of changed across the whatever process. I think I started with very much a mindset where the designation of the recommender matters. I should get it from the senior most possible person in my organization, someone who like for some reason the admissions committee might know or have heard of. So I very much started with that philosophy. Let me get like one person who knows me really well, and the other person, can just write something, and his name will add weight to the recommendation. And I know a lot of people told me that's not the case. A lot of people, including I think The consulting firm I was working with were more leaning towards, let's get someone who knows you really well. But I was like, no, like it's fine. We'll get someone who's will add weight to my application. Uh, I learned from it because I think the first few applications which I had submitted with that philosophy didn't work out very well. Um, Essentially informing me that it's not the weight of the name that really matters, but it's the quality of the recommendation. And also, you can also think it from an admissions committee point of view, right? Like they're not reading recommendations to see, okay, let's see, like what are the big names behind this guy or girl, right? Like that's not their objective. Their objective is just to kind of inform the picture of the applicant. They're trying to like see, okay, whatever is there in the essay, is it complemented by what's being written in the recommendation? Or whatever is there in the resume, is it being complemented by what's in the recommendations? And can we form a full picture of the person in our heads? And can that full picture be admitted to this business school? So I think they just want as many as data points on you, and I think someone who knows you very closely can really add color to your life and to your recommendation. So then my essentially my philosophy shifted to having people who knew me closely. So in the applications which actually worked out at the end for me, I had chosen two immediate supervisors at FSG. So two people I had worked very, very closely with. One of them actually had done business school in the US. So I think that's a definite plus because they already know how the process works. They know what kind of questions the recommendations require and how to answer them and things like that. So obviously, like if you have these things happening in play, it's a good thing. Like one of my recommendations, as I said, was went to business school in the US. The other did not, but still had a pretty good sense of what the recommendation needed, um, and help fill that out. So I think at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to how well do the recommenders know you, how much color can they add to the recommendation, how much time can they spend on the recommendation? Because again, if you get a very senior person to kind of write a recommendation, they're probably going to spend maybe an hour or 2 hours max on it. I knew my immediate supervisors who were much younger, who knew me better, spent days on it. They iterated with me, they thought about certain things, and they used to discuss the recommendation with me as well openly. And I know that's not the case with everyone. But I would say lean on someone who knows you very well, and I think things gonna work out.
Sure, and I think I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. I mean, I think this is something that came up in the last discussion also, was that the content of the recommendation ends up mattering way more than who's writing the recommendation. And so I think that's
Right.
an important takeaway here. Just moving, I think we have a couple of questions and then we can take questions from the audience. The next one is just about the interview experience overall that you had, and how did you sort of prepare for your interviews?
Uh, so I did a couple of things. One, so I did mock interviews. I think that's the most helpful thing. Um, Essentially telling my friends these are the kind of questions you get asked in MBA interviews. Why don't you ask me these questions? I have some responses prepared, and you let me know how whether they came across as authentic, whether they came across as fake. What do you think? So I did that with my friends. I did it with my colleagues as well, and a couple of colleagues had gone to business school in the US, so they already knew how the interview process works. They were a bit more flexible. They came up with questions of their own and things. So I think practice is absolutely key here. The more practice you do, the better your answers get, more confident you become, and your interviews would go well. My interview experience overall was pretty smooth. I think none of the MBA interviews are actually designed to stump you. Uh, they're not one of those like trick question interviews where you're expected to kind of solve an intricate puzzle. They're like really seemingly straightforward questions of like, okay, tell me something about yourself. Like, what do you want to do? Why do you want to do an MBA? Why do you want to come to this school? What do you know about this particular city and things like that, right? Like really straightforward questions, and the kind of question which ideally you should have thought about already, if you have submitted an application to the school. Um, there are obviously many resources available, like consulting firms offer resources on it. There are a lot of websites online which offer resources on it. So my advice would be to just kind of take those resources and make sure you practice, do as many as mock interviews as you can, um, because the questions are going to be largely predictable. And if you can nail those basic questions, I think you should be good to go.
Perfect. Last question, and then we sort of open it up for questions. So I think this is just an overall reflective sort of a question where, like, if you were to do this thing all over again, like, what would be the 3 or 4 things that you would change and like do differently?
Uh, Good question. 3 or 4 things. That's a big list. Let me start with one, and then maybe I can think more. So one, definitely, I would have spent more time on my application. Not to say that I didn't, my application was not strong enough, but I felt like maybe I could have started earlier. A lot of people kind of delay the beginnings of their applications, thinking, oh yeah, the application is due in September. I'll start maybe 3 months back, and when it's 3 months back, it's like, oh, I'll start 2 months before, and 2 months before they'll start 1 month before. So, and it's a basic human psychology happened with me as well. But I hope people can learn from this and start early, which gives you a lot of advantages, right? It gives you the advantage of time, right? You can write something and you can think about it for a week. You can iterate on the essay. You can take feedback from people, and sometimes feedback from people takes time. People don't respond in 24 hours. People respond in weeks sometimes, and that advantage of time kind of gives you that edge. Your recommenders need time as well, right? So I think starting early gives them some head start as well. And I think overall, I think the MBA application process requires you a lot of thinking, a lot of introspection, a lot of writing. Essays are not easy to write. And I discovered, at least in my case, the essays got better the more I worked on them, right? Like it was the output essentially was proportional to the amount of time/effort I put in. So if you can start early, essentially, if you can just expand the amount of time you have, automatically the output's going to be better. And if you just kind of believe in that doctrine, start earlier, and that's, I think, one of the things I would have done different. I think the second thing, as I said, which I did differently in my final business school application, was focus on recommenders which really know you very well. You know, instead of recommenders which add weight to the application but don't really know you very well or can't spend a lot of time on the application. So that's definitely something I would have done differently. What else apart from that? I think the other thing maybe, and now looking back, I can reflect on this because I'm actually in my second year and about to graduate. Um, think about the specific school and like what personally are you thinking of gaining from the MBA? I think a lot of people are very like they know, okay, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm gaining professionally, networking, courses, blah blah blah, things like that. I think the question, what do you personally want to gain out of the MBA, is also very important, and I think should be part of your MBA application process and your interview. And it's not an easy question to answer because an MBA offers you a lot of things at the same time. It offers you learning opportunities and opportunities with professors, recruiting opportunities, and a lot of just have a good time opportunities with friends. So it's very important for you to kind of pick and choose what personally kind of helps you, and that could be forming a circle of close friends, or could be learning how to play the guitar or things like that. And I think that's also a question you need to answer, which will definitely not only help your application but also help your business school experience. So these 3 things.
Right. I think very well put together. I think quickly switching to questions now. So I know we already have a lot of questions, but in case like you haven't posted your question, you can just post your questions and I'll get to them as soon as I can. So I think the first one is a question from Rahul. And what he wants to know is like, so I think just to play back, like, were you also considering between a 1 year and 2 year MBA? And like, if someone is like, what are the factors they should consider between a 1 year MBA and a 2 year MBA?
It was definitely on my mind when starting with the whole process, and I quickly pivoted against it. For a couple of reasons. One, not every business school offers 1 year MBA. So if you want to do an 1 year MBA, there isn't a lot of choice available at least this point in time, which might change in future. I think the second thing is the summer internship is a great opportunity. I feel giving an MBA, which either enables you to try out a certain industry or just like do something which you thought might be good for you, and sometimes allows you to pivot, right? Like you might have dreams of consulting, you might want to do consulting your entire life, and you might land up an extremely prestigious consulting internship, and you might do the internship and come out and say, oh, what, this is definitely not for me, right? And the summer internships allows you to like pivot out of it and say, okay, let's look for something else, or lean into it with more confidence. So I think these two things kind of inform my decision against going for the 1 year MBA. I think the third thing also played to my mind was 1 year MBA is kind of a nascent thing. It's still evolving. It's not as I would say standardized and kind of what's I'm maybe missing the right word here, but as traditional, let's say, as a second year MBA. So the schools are still thinking about it. Recruiters don't know how to treat it. So with all that ambiguity around it, I chose to at least be risk averse and go with the second year.
Sure. And I think just to a small caveat, I think I agree with everything that you're saying, but there are certain 1 year programs that also offer you the opportunity of doing an internship. Like I know like INSEAD's 1 year program does give you that opportunity.
Right,
But
right. Absolutely. Yeah.
right. So I think next question is from Arjun. And I think this might probably wasn't relevant for us when we were applying, but I think just a general sense on older candidates who are like beyond the average age of what an MBA school admits. So like what should they like think about when they are applying?
Right. Uh, Good question. I think the one thing I would first say is I have plenty of 31-year-old friends at Booth. So they form a good chunk. They're not the average, yes, but they form a good chunk of the batch. It's not to say that everyone I meet here is 27 or 28, 29 years old. So I think on being on a little older side and applying, I think the first thing you want to do is just think through as to why this time is the most appropriate time for you to apply for an MBA, right? What's happened in the past, let's say 7, 6, 7, 8 years of work experience you've had? What kind of learnings have you had? Uh, what kind of goals do you have, and how do you aim to achieve them at this point in time? And why was not an MBA undertaken before? And it could be a lot of practical reasons. Maybe we didn't think of it. Maybe you were liking your job too much. Um, a lot of personal things can also come into picture here. Maybe you're focused on getting married or something like that, and now you're kind of settled. Now you can think about your career, and maybe you and your wife both want to come here together. And that really happens, by the way. I know a couple of older couples. So I think just thinking through your story is extremely important. And if you can just make sure you communicate that story very clearly, make sure like people understand why you're doing an MBA at this point in time. And to be honest, like 31 is not a big difference. 31 is not a big difference from 28, right? Like it's 3 years difference. So it's not heaven and earth. So as long as you can communicate that simple difference as to what happened in the last 6, 7 years, what changes have happened, and how you want to like kind of come to the business school and pursue your passion. I think your attitude shouldn't be different from any 28-year-old or let's say 26-year-old applying for an MBA.
Sure. So I think another couple of very important questions raised by Ritwik here. So I think one, he just wants to understand a little bit about the risk COVID sort of has on the overall admissions and even placements. And I think it's a difficult question because we are still sort of living through that and it's not
Right.
over yet. And I think the second question Ritwik is asking here is the importance of GMAT score in admission. So you can take in whichever order these two questions.
I'll take the easier one first, which is the GMAT score. um, So yeah, GMAT score is definitely important. Uh, People look at GMAT scores might like in the first 30 seconds or 1 minute of reading an application, I would say. And you have GMAT averages of schools, right? And you have websites like Poets and Quants comparing GMAT averages. So obviously there's an audience for that, and admissions knows that. Business schools know that, and they try to make sure that the GMAT average doesn't like suddenly plummet 1 year unknowingly. So they're obviously watching for it. Having said that, I feel there's a lot more to your application other than just the GMAT score, and that's very very important as well. So a good thing of thinking about it is like GMAT score is essentially a bar you have to cross, and once you've crossed that bar, everything else is more important, right? Like let's say, and that bar is kind of different from different people. In my head, like at least for Indian applicants, something like a 720 or 730 kind of satisfies that bar. And if you kind of cross that bar, your essay becomes much. So your essay essentially becomes everything. Your resume becomes everything. Your recommendations become everything. So as long as you can cross that minimum threshold, um, I think your energy should be focused on the broader application and not just the GMAT.
Sure.
Um,
Uh,
do you have any
well,
thoughts on that on the GMAT score? Because I know you gave your GMAT twice.
more than twice actually. But yeah, I think I've stressed this earlier as well that I think like GMAT score, especially for Indian applicants, is it's a very important factor. And like I think schools and like even people tend to underplay the importance that the score has in your application. And I think it really truly decides like what's the league of schools you can apply to. Like your scores sort of influences that, and I've lived through it. Like there was once that I applied with a lower GMAT score, and I think like every other part of my application was, I thought it was nearly perfect, and still I couldn't like convert those schools. And I think next year when I applied with a much better school, I think very similar stories, very similar all other aspects of the application, and I got like admits from like multiple schools. So like I cannot stress enough on how important a GMAT score is. But more on
Yeah.
that later. I think
Just
we
on that,
have.
I think starting early also helps. So again, if you start early, if you give yourself a lot of time, then you can give GMAT and see the kind of score you get. And then if you have time, you can obviously give it again, right? And again, like when people start last minute and all these problems come up.
Sure. I think just quickly, I'm going to take a couple of more questions. We're slightly
And we haven't
running.
answered the COVID-19 question, by the way.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes,
Why don't
so
you go
I'll
ahead with
I'll
that?
give my thoughts. I'll give my thoughts on it, and Ayush, you should also chime in because you know as much as I do.
Yeah.
Um, so risks on admissions. To be honest, I again these are all I think personal kind of conjectures at this point. So please take all of this with a grain of salt. My guess would be that admission offers would go up uh, this year, uh, simply because I think a lot of business schools are expecting international students to have issues joining or deferring. Um, so they're expecting yield to actually go down. Yield is essentially the percentage of people who actually end up joining after you've given them an offer. I think and I may be completely off on this, but I think admission offers might go up, and because they're expecting less people to join actually at the end. Um, Obviously, the other thing a lot of people think is how is the business school experience affected, given the fact that you're not allowed to come together anymore. And obviously it is affected. My classes currently, I'm in second year of my booth experience and my final quarter, and my all of my classes happening on Zoom. So I raise my hand, I click a button and I say something. And obviously that's not the same as being in a classroom, but also that's not like it's not completely bad as well. So I would say closely, like I think to a certain extent, 70 or 80% close to what happens in actual classroom. And I mean, you have to do what you have to do, right? So there's no getting out of it. Obviously, it affects the experience, and you should think about it as you apply for the MBA. Maybe is this the best time for you? Maybe not. Maybe yes. In terms of placements, quickly, again, the US economy is definitely entering a recession at this point, or a mild recession to say the least. So obviously, recruiting would be affected. Uh, the question would be how quick the recovery would be. And if you're entering at this point, which is what, 2020, you would be graduating in 2022. Um, you might think that 2022 might be a much better time to graduate than now. So you can enter a business school thinking that, you know what, 2022 would be a good time. Again, I can't predict the future, but my gut says that by 2022 things would be fine. Ayush, you should also weigh in on.
Sure. So I think I completely agree with the thing that you just said, that, it's a, and I think I was reading an article somewhere which said that during recessions, more people actually end up going for like an MBA or a master's degree, right? Because they know that, okay, professionally, next couple of years might not be great time because there might be more
Right.
workload, promotions might not be as fast. So like, what should they do? Study and like,
Yeah.
like get enrolled for a
Do the
master's
MBA.
degree. And like,
Yeah.
obviously, like 2 years down the line, like economists are predicting that, because there was nothing fundamentally wrong with the US economy and I think the global economy, uh, people predict that once the pandemic is over, things should be in recovery mode fairly quickly. So I think that's definitely something that you want to consider. And I think to add to your first point about a loss in business school experience, I think what I want to add here is that I know Columbia is currently planning to resume everything like starting August. So I mean, like right now, where the pandemic is, I mean, like I don't think for people who would be like entering this August, like their experience would change at all. But again, like I think the situation is so dynamic and we are in a flux right now that it's hard to really take a call on that. But I think, and I also think like a lot of people who are on the chat right now would probably be targeting MBAs for like admissions next year. So I don't think they should be
Oh,
thinking
right.
about this
Right. Right.
situation
Right.
too much right now. And I think we are all just waiting and seeing what's going to happen. So maybe next couple
Yeah.
of months should probably give us a better idea. Okay, last question, and I think it's a very interesting question from Shubham, and he wants to ask like, how do you justify the transition from PwC to the social sector, applications? And I think similarly, he's talking about how he's switched from healthcare to financial inclusion. So I think the larger question there being like where you already switched industries before doing an MBA, like how do you sort of justify that in your application?
Um, So I'll answer with my story, right? So I was in PwC, was doing analytics consulting. Essentially, was consulting with large organizations and working with a lot of data. And I was working very hard, and at that point in time, I was like, if I'm working so hard, might as well do something that has some sort of real impact on the ground. So that was my like, basic philosophy at this point in time. And a friend of mine told me about FSG and the fact that they were recruiting and the kind of work they did. I read a few research papers that put out, and I was really kind of fascinated by the kind of work they were doing. Um, so and I eventually just ended up applying there. And when I applied there, I was not 100% sure of joining. Um, and I gave a couple of interviews. Really liked the people there. Really liked the kind of questions they were asking and the kind of work they were doing. And I said, you know what, this sounds like a fascinating piece of job, and I would want to work here, and that's how I ended up joining. And this is kind of very close to what I wrote in the application as well. I started by saying, I was working very hard. I like the job, but if I'm working so hard, might as well do something that's more impactful. And hence the switch happened. So I wouldn't think of like justifying this transition in some sort of convoluted way. Try to be close to reality, and it resonates with people when it sounds real, right? And I think people think of justifying transitions by making up stories. Instead, I think what you should do is think about what actually happened, and think about the 10 things that played in your mind, and the 10 things that happened to you. And like when you mention those 10 things in an application, uh, I think people think, oh my god, this is real, right? A lot of things are happening at this point. People make personal decisions because for example, here Shubham is saying he switched from healthcare to financial inclusion. There could be things about maybe you were appealed by the finance sector, or maybe you were appealed by the kind of impact financial inclusion has on people as opposed to healthcare. There were many things about career changes, the kind of people you want to work with, the kind of long-term career trajectory, location of the job. So I think you should mention all of these things when you're mentioning a transition, and just make it real, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think I know you made that switch, and I think I've made that switch at least like 3 or 4 times in my career, because I did engineering, then I did
Yeah,
sales, then I did
sale.
liberal
Yeah,
arts, and then when finally I was in social impact consulting. So I think the way I sort of portrayed that was just like really being very honest, as in like, why did I take the steps that I took in my career? And like, I think people like that. Like, people like honesty more than the fact that you switched. I think if you can just justify why you made the switch, I think that's great. Okay, I think with that, we are slightly beyond time, but this was great. Thank you, Vishesh. I think really good responses. I'm sorry, I probably wasn't able to go through all the questions that came under comments, but I think please feel free to reach out to me and even Vishesh. Like, if you have any other questions, Vishesh should be more than happy to
yeah,
get to
absolutely.
your questions. And a very quick plug for thank you everyone for joining in. I think a very quick plug for next week's session, which is happening on Monday, same time, next Monday. The speaker is Ariba, which Vishesh also knows really well. And
Yes,
she
I know
just
her.
graduated from INSEAD and will be joining McKinsey soon. So again, like, she has some very interesting perspectives to share, especially between like a 1-year MBA and a 2-year MBA. And looking forward to seeing many of you in next week's session. Thank you and have a good day, everyone. Thank you, Vishesh.
Thank you.
Bye bye.